All right. All right. Good afternoon. This is the subcommittee on data for the Human Service Background Eligibility Task Force. Hopefully I said the name correctly. Today is Friday, February the 18th, and we are prepared to get started. If we could please do roll call.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Ms. Evans?
Here.
Mr. Kammer? Mr. Kammer? Ms. Mattson?
Here.
Thank you. Representative Mueller? Representative Mueller? Ms. Robertus?
Hi.
And Ms. Williamson?
Present.
All right, Madam Chair, 4 of the 6 members are present. A quorum is present.
All right, fantastic. And so in adoption of the previous meeting minutes, are there any corrections that need to be made? Any discussion regarding those? If not, we can adopt the previous meeting minutes. Okay, it is a snowy Friday afternoon, so we're gonna get right into it and then be done for any of you that have to travel here. All right, so I know on the agenda we have discussion time for alternative data sources. I do want to acknowledge and welcome DHS representative, Ms. Emily, and it's Kassane.
Yes.
Please correct me if I said it wrong. All right. So we just wanted to acknowledge you in this space on today, and just start off to see if there's any report that you want to make or anything you want to state at this meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. I know that you're expecting the third data report, and I have an update for that. I don't have the report yet. It's in the final review, so we expect to have it to you early next week, along with some answers to questions that you'd pose. But definitely the third data set, you can expect to see that early next week.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So I just want to open up if members have any questions for DHS. Looks like our vice chair.
I do have a question. So one of the things that we have been just discussing, in preparation for the, March report that's due, and in some conversations that we've been having, is the set aside data, as well as data around conduct, like disqualifying conduct. And so it's really important that we get that data. And I just am wondering if we can get some kind of, maybe approximate time when we're going to have that data from DHS. And so if you could bring Emily that question, Ms. Kassane, back to the team, the data team at DHS, and we could just get some kind of a approximate timeline when we're going to have that data. Because that's the bulk of this work. And I know that's not the data set that's coming next. And so if we could find out when we're going to have those pieces of data, that would be great.
Thank you, Vice Chair Evans. I'm happy to get that. So it was the set-asides, and I'm making notes here. Yeah. The set-asides and then the specific conduct?
The disqualifying conduct.
Okay.
I think that's what you guys call it. It's crimes, but I think you guys call it something different.
Yeah. So yes, thank you, Vice Chair and members. I'll absolutely get that information back to you as soon as I can.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and that was a great question. And just to follow up, Mr. Vogel, are you able to just state how we listed that in our written request to DHS?
Certainly, Madam Chair. Just a moment, actually. Let me pull up that document, and I'll read out the precise language.
My apologies for putting you on the spot. I try not to do that.
No worries, Madam Chair.
I just want to make
I-
sure that the language is the language is the same, so that we're clear,
Definitely.
the verbiage.
Sorry, I'm juggling quite a few documents here, so just a moment.
And while he's pulling that up, so in opening the discussion in regards to alternative data sources, I just want to, again, just have it where we can just discuss some ideals that members have in regards to alternative sources. I know we've raised some in previous meetings, and just want to make sure that we are paying attention to all of the suggestions, maybe even brainstorm some new ones on today, so that we can start the process of retrieving that data from alternative sources. And then Mr. Vogel also can speak to that. There was some additional information that connection that I had sent out. And so just to see what results we have of that as of this point.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So to that point first, I'd like to point out that well, this is reminding you of what you've already done, but just to point out to the members that you've done some research looking at databases maintained by the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And I can send out a link to the DEED database that you sent me to the members, which would allow the members to gather some statistics on employment categories that require a DHS background study. And then in answer to your previous question, got them stacking up. If you don't mind, actually, Madam Chair, I'll just share my screen briefly.
Yes, please.
Here's a master document of the requests that the members have placed with DHS so far. So here's the first request that was placed in December, which I think is what the first 3 data sets are answering. Then the requests placed on the 10th and 18th of January. And so on the 10th of January, you asked about quantitative data on the timeliness of the background study process, including the set-aside process. And then on the 18th, you asked essentially for disaggregated data on cases where set aside or reconsideration, variance, et cetera, is not sought and is sought. So essentially honing in on that set aside process, like Vice Chair Evans was talking about. And then Vice Chair Evans also mentioned specific conduct. I don't know if that's actually been a formal data request as of yet. Yeah, just let me read over this language and I'll point out if I see any, if I see that as a specific request. But since the members do have Ms. Kassane here, if you'd like, I could type something up.
Yes, that would be appreciated. Just to make sure that thank you for pulling this up. And this was the purpose of that, just to make sure there wasn't a disconnect, and seems to be so. So yeah, let's go ahead and make that connection in regards to the Vice Chair Evans. You said it was basically the crimes, but what was the verbiage that you used?
Disqualifying
events?
conduct. So what is the conduct that people are getting disqualified for? Because we know like how many disqualifications have been done, but not necessarily what they're being disqualified for. So we have like the whole bucket of data, but not, and broken down by race, but not broken down by crime. So we ask for disaggregated data for certain things, but not for everything. So.
All right, Mr. Vogel, you have that.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'll type up some specific requests and send it over to DHS after this meeting. So I guess look for that document, Ms. Kassane. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Any other discussion in regards to alternative data sources?
So I did get, they sent out a survey with March about timeframes and how many set asides and all of that stuff, but not very many people filled the survey out. And so it wasn't a very good source of information. And then I'm still waiting for to hear back from Representative Knorr about some other requests that he's made. And so I'm still waiting to hear back on a couple other avenues, just as an update.
All right. Sounds good. All right, I just want to make sure I didn't miss Member Matson or Member Robertus.
Thank you, Chair. Nothing to add at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you both. All right, thank you all. Okay, and so in regards to our next agenda item, which is discussion of recommendations for interim report, I do want to just, as we open up to have this discussion, I would like for us in reference to recommendations, basically, how we were able to pull up the written request for DHS and collectively formalize that request. I'm hoping that on today we can also open up a working document to state some key findings. I know we've verbalized them, and there's been some amazing pie charts and collection of data that Member Cameron had put together. Our vice chair even put together a wonderful pie chart to give us that visual. So I'm hoping that on today we can kind of just restate some of those key findings, just so we have that as well as, or have it in one spot in one document. And then also to begin the discussion in regards to recommendations as a result of those key findings, as we are narrowing into the purpose of the subcommittee, as we're yet still waiting for different data sets and additional alternative data to come in. So with that, I will open the floor to see, do we want to start with recommendations, or like I said, just more so just restating some of the key findings that many of you have already, all of you that really have made mention in previous meetings.
Madam Chair, I guess I would prefer perhaps going over the details of the data and kind of restating those assumptions or those what we've learned from the data. I don't feel comfortable making any recommendations yet, also because I feel like we need to be informed by the other subcommittees and kind of what their findings are. I guess that's just my initial reaction to that.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you for, I can definitely clarify my request for today. This is recommendations that we want to suggest. So this isn't like our approved or our formal or final list that we will be actually submitting to the task force. I just want to get the conversation, the discussion started on suggestions that we want to add to then finalize to submit. So thank you.
I'm kind of with Nicole, just for seeking clarification. I think I sort of asked last week too, and I wasn't sure. I'm not sure I'm still quite there yet. The purpose of our group was, I thought, to just gather the data and then give to the other subgroups, which then are responsible for recommendations. So that's where I kind of asked, like, how do we connect? Are we charged with also coming up with recommendations? Because that's not necessarily how I understood it. I'm okay with if that's what we want to propose, but I think that we're all sort of on the same page with now what do we do kind of question. Did we do our due diligence? Because I almost feel like once we get some of these data points, I feel like we've done what we were charged to do. we've then provided the other two groups with what they need to then do the recommendations. That's sort of where I saw us, but if we want to reevaluate, I'm open for it, but I just didn't see us doing the recommendation portion.
Yep, nope, that is what John asked us to do, is as a subcommittee, was to pull the data together and then get it to the other two subcommittees to make recommendations. Yep. So, I mean, at this point, I think maybe what Tashonda is asking us to do is to, what were the key findings? And is there anything that we can ascertain from those key findings as, for me, just looking at the couple of big, for me, looking at the couple of key larger groups of the in-home care, the substance use disorder group, and I'm not going to spend you guys' time looking for it, but there's one other group that they have a lot of disqualifications. And that just happens to be, I'm listening into the DHS hearings right now, and that happens to be the same groups of people that are in there, hello, Nicole, talking about this workforce shortage that is crippling their industry. And so, like, how do we tie the data that we have with the information that they have to say, how do we get people that aren't a public safety risk? Maybe it's just drugs. I have another piece of data that I'll share with you guys, and I'm going to bring this up in the meeting we have later today, Jolene, that 62% of women that are incarcerated in Shakopee today are there for drug and alcohol crimes. But when you look at the data of the DOC as a whole, only 20% of the whole population of the DOC is in there for drug and alcohol crimes. So why are women more often incarcerated for drugs and alcohol than men are? And that is, I just found that out today, and I'm still reeling from it a little bit. But how does that equate to then employment later on, right? That it's keeping them from being employed later on. And so so that's the kind of stuff, like, how do we share that other alternative data? And I would love to see, Jolene, you, not DOC, but you specifically come up with some sort of presentation to share around that, because I think with the group and, the MCA and the judges and all that stuff, how do we show them that, the substance use disorder piece of this could get pulled out separately in some way to get folks back to work, and that the risk of harm is less? And, like, how do we do that? Because you're talking about recommendations, and maybe this isn't recommendations, but do you feel like, Nicole, with your line of work, that maybe those folks pose a risk of harm less long? That was a terrible sentence. Than maybe folks that have crimes against people or whatever. And so that was very long-winded, but, like, those are some assumptions I feel like we could find a way to show for the folks that we're working with. And we hold them accountable for 15 years.
So maybe it's a collection of questions to say, this is what sparked our, thoughts or collective out, whatever our perspective is. But to me, to answer your question, I would need to have relative comparison to say, that relative statistic is meaningful, because in other states, the proportion of women or proportion of, is less, so that you've got some sort of comparative data to say we're doing things differently and we're perhaps hurting ourselves unnecessarily. Otherwise, I have no basis of knowing other than personal feeling, which shouldn't enter in here. It should, you know what I mean? It should just be based on fact. Yeah. So that's where I'm like, well, to me, I would need the other committees who are doing that research on, other states and, other data points to kind of contextualize and give a whole picture to say this is,
Mhm.
but certainly could come up with a list of questions that, you know, when we've gone through the data. Yeah, there have been things that have stood out. You know, even though I mean, we still have some yet to come too. So
Mhm.
Yeah, whether we're calling them sparked interest or a list of questions, it doesn't matter to me what we title it, but being able to have a
Yeah.
collective list because we're seeing the data first. And so we are a part of the larger task force. So this is kind of getting the wheels turning, if you will,
Mhm.
with us being able to collectively kind of have that start, if you will. So however y'all want to call it, that's fine by me. I just would
Interesting.
like for us to do that.
Interesting points of interesting. We're making points. Here's what we
Mhm.
saw that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um. So yeah,
So
I feel like even when we get the data though, like compared, I agree with Nicole, compared to what? That's the
mhm.
other point of it, like where we need to get this other information in, not from DHS, like from other states, from DOC, because otherwise it's just arbitrary numbers. And I couldn't agree with you more.
right. So
Yeah.
you're either comparing it year to year, you're comparing the data to yourself and how it's changed, and that, you know, there's something impact, like we've talked about that, where all of a sudden there's a spike in disqualifications. What's about, you know, so there's that, but then there's also comparing to other levels from similar size states to say, okay, well, in these other states, the proportions are different. You know, presumably people are people wherever you go. So that comparison, I think, is critical.
Mhm. Mr. Vogel, could you please let us know? I know you've been doing some state by state comparisons. Have there been any in your research that and I know you're still working on all of that, but has any of it lined up with data that we specifically asked for in this subcommittee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd say the one-word answer is no, but to explain that a bit further, the comparative research I've been doing, mostly for the remedies subcommittee, has been focused on other states' legal structures, their statutes that are comparable to 245C, rather than gathering specific data on disqualifications in those states. That being said, I'd say that research is somewhat relevant to this discussion because in a way, it seems like comparing Minnesota to a lot of these states would be comparing apples and oranges. So, for example, the vast majority of the statutes from other states that I've seen specify convictions or other, adjudications of delinquency, that sort of thing, but other high legal standards as what they're looking for in a background study, which is a higher evidentiary standard than the preponderance of evidence standard used in Minnesota. So even without having any data from those states, I would wonder if, for example, there's more disqualifications in Minnesota simply because we have a lower evidentiary standard. That's just pure speculation, and that the research on data from other states I haven't done. But I just want to let you know that the research I have been doing might tell you something about whether that data is, I don't want to say even worth looking for, but what that data might get you essentially.
That makes a lot of sense, but from an outcome perspective, I guess, so even though the process could be different and it's not, maybe I get, pure levels of disqualification, but from an outcome perspective, do you see, or do we see less or more issues with, crimes in group homes, assisted living, you know what I'm saying, as far as an outcome of, presumably that's why we're disqualifying people, is to prevent harm. Yep. So are there less cases of harm, the same cases of harm? Do you know where I'm going with that, as far as from an outcome perspective, not from a how the person is disqualified in the first place?
Ms. Matson, Madam Chair, that actually does make a lot of sense. Yeah, I can try to start some research along those lines. I will say I off the top of my head, I don't know how successful I'll be in getting that done quickly before this interim report. I'd need to well, I need to think about my research strategy, but I can definitely try to look into that.
And even if we don't have it on a high priority list, it can still kind of be on the list as we have the rest of the year. Because I think we'll find some, again, evidence to the apparent.
Yep. And again, the same thing that I said before, Will, like, while a 50 state research project is fabulous, what about a 5-state project where we're looking at Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Illinois, which are states that are more politically like ours, instead of doing every single state? Do you know what I mean?
wholeheartedly agree
Iowa.
with that. A sampling
Yep.
based on
Mhm.
some sort of similarity, either geography, something that makes sense to
size.
say these are somewhat similar. Yeah, that's
Yep.
a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Evans, Ms. Matson. I'll definitely do my strategy that way. And just for some context, that's essentially how my legal research strategy is moving as well. Focus on states essentially comparable to Minnesota culturally or politically.
Yeah. And the reason I say politically is just because of what we're going to be up against with the legislature after our recommendations get done. So using states that are comparable to our makeup is going to be, saying California did this isn't going to matter much when we are trying to get it done at the legislature. So just FYI.
Mhm. And member Robertus, I just want to see just your capacity in regards to the request that Vice Chair Evans had made. If that's something that's doable for you.
I would say yes. I think just a little bit more specific information of what the presentation would want to include, and then we could try to get something pulled together for sure. And that would work with my peeps.
Yeah, we could talk about it, Jolene, like what would be beneficial. Like I'm trying to get somebody to come in and do something on brain development that like somebody that nobody knows to like discount, somebody from like out of state, a psychologist or whatever. But I feel like the more outlying information that we can get folks that just speaks to the problem itself is going to be really important for folks on the full task force. So we can talk about that offline if you want.
Yeah.
All right. Was there any other discussion in regards to the interim report?
Hi, Roy.
So sorry I am late.
No worries. Welcome, Member Kama. So we're at the discussion of recommendations for an interim report. We did have somewhat of a discussion in regards to alternative data services, or excuse me, data sources, because we were just informed that DHS plans to have that third data set submitted to us the earlier part of next week, possibly. So we just wanted to just open up yet in regards to alternative data sources. I did provide a link from the librarian at Deed that gives us a source, a link in regards to getting that additional statistical data. And then also I just kind of had put out a charge to the group today. We're looking at how to title this, but just looking to have a working document, if you will, of like the key findings, just restating those key findings. They're all on one document, in addition to listing, like, so I said like suggestions for recommendations, or point of interest, or special vice chairs Vice Chair, how did you say that?
I think you just said it really well, and that would be key findings. And so, Roy, I think, you looking at the data like down to the nitty gritty, is there anything that should include in that report that's due March 1st in the key, like any key findings from the data that you would say should be included in the report for March 1st, or that we should include in our recommendations for our recommendations for key findings to the bigger task force. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, I guess my question is are there things that, we think that are surprising to the people who will be reading the report? Certainly, some of the high level numbers are important just to see volume. But I think, one of the things that stands out for me is there was an increase in volume from 2018 to 2019. We got, some context for that at the last meeting of some of the statutory changes and such like that. But I think that's an important call out. For me, I think, what are some of the, where are the areas where we're seeing the most, most background studies being done, and then where are we seeing the most disqualifications? I think by percentage. I think that was some of the other interesting information for me that I had in some of my slides from the data set one. And then I think the overarching thing that's just, I think, so key for me is, everything we've looked at, I think importantly, we've looked through this, lens of, disparity. And we're seeing, racial and ethnic disparities, just as we go through. And I think that should be articulated because, what we heard again from the, DHS is that it's a downstream effect that, this trickles to them. And yes, I believe there's a lot of merit to that, but it doesn't mean that we don't talk about it, and say, are there things we can be doing differently? It's still, it's important information. And I don't think they're saying, let's not talk about it either. I think, it's just it's a topic where they may not feel that they have a lot of control over it, but certainly I think it's very notable and something I would include. So those just off the cuff are a few things that pop into my mind.
Yeah, Roy, I think about this and it's so much deeper than just the background study, right? It speaks to the systemic racism that exists within the entire criminal justice system. So maybe even a data point, we know there's disparities in drug charges, right? Between Black and brown bodies and then white counterparts. And so maybe just as a database group, do we need to bring some of that forward from a more general sense of who's more likely to be given charges, more harsher sentences, and things like that, that would then ultimately impact anything going forward in their life.
These collateral, because this is what we're talking about is collateral consequences, right? And so I agree with that 100%. And it should be, at this point, that's the data that we have, right? Is that it lines up almost perfectly with the data that we have coming out of the DOC with those disparities. So I think that's a key finding that we should put in there, Will.
And to member Matson's point about staying focused on the facts versus personal feelings, it is a challenge, I can say personally, just having lived experience or witnessing those who have had negative impacts, and to know that something wasn't right, but then just to see that the data shows that. So it is somewhat of a challenge, but it's possible. And again, I just want to make sure that this subcommittee, we can, get as far ahead as we can, because the time is of essence. And there's already so much time that we've lost just in trying to be patient and wait for different steps of the process to get, what we've requested. So yeah, it's just really being mindful more so to stay ahead of the curve where we can. And that is with all of your expertise and convictions and passions, being able to highlight those key findings. Mr. Vogler, unless anyone else has something else to add, Mr. Vogler, do you mind just kind of summarizing what you've gathered in this discussion, just so that we can make sure nothing's missed?
Certainly, Madam Chair. So I think the points Professor Kammer made line up with what I heard from other members. So I'm just going to read off the notes I made as he made them, if that's okay. So interesting or key findings would be an increase in disqualifications between 2018 and 2019, which, again, there's some context or explanation for, but it's still very interesting. That certain areas or programs see high rates of studies or disqualifications. So, for example, I think off the top of my head, substance use disorder treatment sees fairly high rates of disqualification, and particularly for certain racial or ethnic groups, where which dovetails with the next point, that we can see in this data significant disparities in outcome for especially non-white racial or ethnic groups, which, in turn, I don't know how much the group would want to do a discussion on where that's coming from, this being downstream and reflecting the criminal justice system or not. But just in this data, we do see a disparity in outcome. And yeah, those essentially, I think, are the 3 points I just took away from your discussion. But please correct me if you'd like me to, add something else or change what I have in my notes.
Madam Chair, Mr. Vogel, I think also the perspective of the value of the background study process to the over, from an outcome perspective, are in a comparison. And I think I have a particular interest as an employer is what we're getting for the process, equating to less instances of abuse or neglect, or potentially what we're screening for in our settings. Are we seeing that as a result of the system that we have?
Yeah, the risk of harm.
Yes, thank you for articulating that better than I.
Yeah, are we eliminating the risk of harm for the bear that the process is?
Thank you, Ms. Mattson, Ms. Evans, Madam Chair. I had that in my notes as a research project I'm going to get started on to try to get a comparative picture there. When I was writing these, though, I was under the impression that since the group doesn't have any data on that right now, just personal impressions, I was under the impression that you wouldn't necessarily want to raise that as a key point for this interim report. But do you?
I think we can hold off on that and then see, as we're collecting data.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I think that's a conversation, though, that after this interim report is over, so that was one of the things, and Jolene, you talked about this too. I think it would be really good if we could at some point have a conversation about what do we want to show and how do we get there, right? Because we keep talking about DHS and data and all that stuff. And I agree with you, Nicole, wholeheartedly. That's something we need to figure out how to show. What is the risk of harm and how much is too much work to get to there? And how do we show that? What is the data what is the information we need to bring forward to show the full task force that the risk of harm for certain offenses, the work that we're doing to eliminate the risk of harm, or to make sure that this individual doesn't pose the risk of harm, all this work that we're doing for all these years is over and above for the risk of harm that this one individual maybe is gonna have. How do we show that? What are the things we could do to provide data that I don't think is going to come from DHS? It's going to come from somewhere else. How are we going to show that? So that's one thing, right? How do we show the process itself doesn't equate to the risk of harm. And then there, what else do we want to show? Right?
Well, and I think that's both qualitative and quantitative, right? Because we've already had, specific stories and individual stories, which are highly impactful. And I think that has value, just individual stories and, how this has affected my life. But then also comparative data. If you're looking at the high volume rates of background studies and disqualifications that are in our settings, we have a fairly regulated industry with lots of data to pull as far as harm that occurs. I mean, there's state level data, there's federal level data that we could look at. And maybe it is, again, talking with the other task force to figure out, what are those areas that we narrow in on. It's too much to look at all of it, but we could look at the high volume areas, the areas with the most amount of data available.
So Jolene, do you feel like reoffense data would be part of that then, to show risk of harm that we would need?
I don't know.
Like, I feel like
Because
we need to
again,
get
right,
organized.
now we're like just like funneling like continued like disparity outcomes, right? Like reoffense and reconvictions, still are heavy on those that are, non-white counterparts. I don't know, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. And then I'm kind of like totally going in another direction of a data point, and I'm not even sure if this is even possible because this is really nitty gritty. But I think about some scenarios that just don't make any darn sense, right? Like, we had an individual who lived permanently at this residence, right? And he had a sex offense history background, but he lived permanently at this resident, had been a resident for a year or something, and then decided he wanted to work in the kitchen at the group home that he lived in. And he couldn't do that because he couldn't pass the background study and was excluded. But there's no less or more risk with him working in the kitchen in the environment he lives in, right? And it's also not a job where it puts him in a power position, right? And so is there any way for us to examine some of those scenarios where it just logically, there's no risk change there, right? Like, and so how many people does that impact, right? Where they're already present in that environment regardless. So that's another scenario. And I don't know if data wise we could ever capture that, but for me, it's like almost like that was so silly. And I think it was one of those offenses that you couldn't even make a case for it.
Yep. I talked to, I think it was the nursing home association, who's not a licensed board. So he ended up saying, like, I don't fit who you're looking for, but they actually put in some legislation so that their housekeeping, kitchen staff and maintenance staff don't have to go through the set aside process or go through the process to be able to have those staff in the building, because they were having such a hard time finding staff. And so they found a workaround for it or whatever.
Yeah, we still are subject to the background study for all of our folks in nursing homes. Everybody. Maybe they proposed it and it didn't go anywhere. I don't know.
Oh.
As I'm listening to everyone, it seems as though, I don't know if this could turn into a recommendation, but in a sense, being able to create a new assessment or evaluation or checklist, I'm not sure how that would go, what it would tangibly become, but just being able to have somewhat of a standard. It could be something specific to nursing homes, something specific to housing or kitchen work. That's just where there is a series of questions that has been reviewed externally to, whether it's DHS that's conducting or however, just to then be able to look at like those logical, touch points or key points to see the person versus just paper and the numbers, right? I don't know. So much. All right. Well, with that being said, was there anything else that we want to add? This is a great discussion.
One of the things I'm trying to think of a way to measure this, and one of the things running through my head is in data set 2, we had the rat back determination. So again, if I'm completely understanding rat back, these are people who are in place, and then another offense pops up. And I think I need help thinking through this too, but I'm just looking at one of the tables even from like 2018, 2019 here, but looking in general, like at people who are determined low severity, even just looking at the number of rat backs that come back, there's 165 out of a total of 2,385 low severity determinations. So that's not a large number of people having additional sort of legal situations that pop up, if that makes any sense. So I don't know if there's some merit there in looking at that. I can say as we jump higher, it looks like the percentages are maybe a little bit greater. So I don't know. I'm just thinking that there might be something there, because ratbacks, would be, additional offenses that pop up. And, if it's this severe, you'd think, well, wouldn't everyone, be getting additional offenses? And the obvious answer is no. But may not be the type of data we're needing. I'm just trying to think out loud. So sorry.
Well, I know we've talked in the past about the importance of that case by case approach. Just having this blanket decision that's being made for people is very problematic. So we can even look in that regard, just doing more research, or I don't know if it's a matter of us trying to see about data that is on a case by case basis. I don't know any offhand, but that seems like that would also aid in this.
I think, like I see the merit in some of the single case, situations. I mean, those are important. My question though is when this, report goes back to, the legislature, how swayed will they be by single cases versus are they going to want something bigger? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do we come up with something that's persuasive enough? Because we can come up with a lot of great single cases where the outcome is good. I suspect there might be others who come up with single cases where the outcome's not so good. So I'm trying to think, what can we do on a grand enough scale that would be persuasive in nature? So that's kind of the question I have going through my mind, because I imagine people would be looking, going, yes, we know there's these good cases, but we're worried about these ones that don't turn out well. So how do we, come up with something overall that says, yeah, all in all, we put a lot of effort into, disqualifying people for these limited situations, but the vast majority are non-problematic. How do we come up with some sort of data source that tells us that? So I think that's a challenge.
Wouldn't that be the set-aside process, though, and making sure that was robust and effective and that people actually availed themselves of that, and not necessarily, I guess that's one of my assumptions, personal assumptions anyway, is that a lot of people probably don't even attempt to get a set-aside and likely could. And what are the what are the impacts and effects of that? And is it, a fair process? Is it a known process? Do people have access to information? All that, which is probably not real data heavy, but it could be known facts.
Yep, I think, and making sure that the permanent list has the crimes on it that are people that we're, really afraid of. And then maybe that, I think part of the problem is that all felonies are 15 years, and that as taxpayers, we're paying for set asides for 15 years for really low level crimes, low severity level crimes, And so, and how do we, we need to get the set aside data, I think, to, what are we doing set asides on? And that's the thing, what are we trying to show? And then are we getting do we have requests in for the data that we need to see? And I know, Jolene, you talked about that. I feel like we need to get organized and make sure that we have data requests in to get to data to show what we're trying to show. And so I would like to maybe at our next meeting, continue this conversation. I have to get to my next thing at 1:00, but continue this conversation in that vein, around that. What is it that we're trying to show, in that, because right now all felonies are 15 years. And so for 15 years, anytime I applied for a job with my 5th degree possessions, I had to reapply and reapply and reapply for a set aside. And every felony conviction, regardless of risk of harm, for 15 years, that was the case. And so and we don't even have that.
I'm just
the
saying,
data
that's ridiculous.
We don't even
Thank
have
you.
the data that we need at this point to show that. And I don't even know that maybe we've even asked for it
Mhm.
properly at this point. So,
And why
Yeah.
can a set aside follow you from setting to setting like that? I guess I'm putting that out as a question.
so we
Yeah,
asked
that's-
about that because we tried to do a traveling set aside, and because of the risk of harm, you would need to travel from exactly the same type of facility and provider type to exactly the next kind of facility and provider type. And so it didn't work out. We got a bill passed, but it didn't work out exactly like we intended for it to. And you have to be serving the exact same population, and age group and all of that stuff. And so these are the kind of things, thinking about what are the outcomes that we're looking for, and then what is the data we need to show to get the outcome we're looking for. Am I making sense?
Yes, you are. And that's definitely something to notate. Member Robertus, you had your hand raised.
I'm with Gina. I gotta rock and roll to my 1:00. Thank you so much. This has been exciting. I think too, in the end, through this conversation, it kind of talked about what you did, Ms. Williamson, we're bringing forward data, but I guess it does kind of come with we need to maybe have some objectives of what
That's
key
the
pieces of
word.
data that sort of are recommendations, but we bring the data that kind of speak for themselves. But anyways, it all is full circle.
Yes,
I gotta go.
Yes, I know that we need to adjourn here. I just want to quickly state it to that point. We maybe can, in what Professor Cameron was mentioning, we can look at the cost in regards to those set asides, getting that actual data of the cost. I know legislation really likes to see what the money is doing.
Fiscal note, that's a great idea. That's a
Mhm,
fantastic idea, Tashonda.
All right, well,
Bye,
with
y'all.
that, we can adjourn. See you all. Our next meeting is the March
Madam Chair,
4th.
Madam Chair, that's 2 weeks from now. So please let me know if noon on March 4th doesn't work for you. Otherwise, I'll send out an invite.
Yes, all right. See you all. We can adjourn.